everyone. I'm really glad we all got to have lunch before you have to listen to me for a while here. As you know, my name is Fiona Lauridsen, and I farm with my husband Peter and my children. And today I want to thank my children in particular because they are my technical assistants. I'm a housewife and a farmer, I'm not a computer technician, so Ayana prepared the PowerPoint for me, and Kai explained to me how you work a graphics program, which would have probably taken me about 2 years to figure out, so that was just fantastic. But what I'm going to do is I am going to share with you my personal story of what happened to me when I reported contamination of groundwater to the authorities. This happened after the arrival of coal bed methane on my land. At the time, I didn't really know that. I just knew that something had gone wrong with the water. So I found out, everything I found out after the fact. Part of my story, Ayana taught me how to push the buttons too. Part of my story was told in the documentary Burning Water. And there were some parts of this story that were too dull and too technical to be in a film. And so those are the parts that I'm going to tell you about today. In rural Alberta, as you know, there are many stories of people who have gas in their water. Gas that most likely came to surface through a series of natural cleats and fault lines under the ground. Now here's my thought on this. If a company decides to go after this gas, and they know that they're operating in this fragile subsurface with all these cleats and fault lines in it, surely they would also know that there's an increased likelihood of things going wrong, of having problematic outcomes if you're working in such a subsurface. At least that's what I would think. We can witness in simple everyday places how fractures behave. When you look at a mud puddle and watch it dry out in the sun, or put pressure on an ice puddle, you see that fractures naturally tend to form networks. So I think about that because I get some of my information from nature, like Mona Lee was saying, we observe what's going on around us. And I also watch the windshield of my car as the blocks come up from the gravel roads and ping on them, and I've got about 6 dings on my windshield by now. And what happens is when the temperature drops, or you get one more rock on the windshield, suddenly all these individual damage points join up, and the whole thing is fractured from one end to the other. I believe that my neighbour's water wells and that my water wells were suddenly inundated with methane because a company drove fractures into the aquifer in an attempt to release gas for commercial purpose. We're no longer talking about the natural fractures of folklore. These are new. These are industrial strength fractures. It's my opinion that the industrial fractures being created today could well have adverse consequences for future generations that we, as the generation in power, are dealing with by using what I call the first law of problem solving. Denial. The simplest way to deal with an outcome that you don't like is to deny it. Then you don't have a problem anymore. The other thing that you can do is that you can justify it, you can dilute it, and you can deflect the problem. And an example of this is we're told our economy would collapse and people will be unemployed. We have to keep fracking because then only a few rural folks might be inconvenienced, and the rest of us, well, we'll all be much better off. If there really is a problem with groundwater, then we can use river water. And if there isn't a river, well, they're kind of stupid to live there, aren't they? You see, you can belittle and blame the messengers and the victims. They become the problem. which imagines that Canadians will fare better with fracking because of our self-proclaimed world-class regulations is absolute folly. The planet doesn't recognise the 49th parallel. Fractures don't suddenly form the ability to control themselves and behave politely because they're made in Canada. The fact is that we have many of the same companies using the same products and methods to extract our gas and oil as they do in the United States. To dismiss what's happening in the United States is to bury ourselves in nationalistic vanity if we believe it couldn't happen here. Landowners across the American continent are standing up and saying, "There's a problem here. My water's contaminated. My animals are sick. My family's health is failing. And all of this happened since you put in these wells." The observations of many landowners are being denied by industry and governments alike. We have a problem, all right, and it's not a PR problem. It's a real, people are suffering because of this activity problem. Industrial developers and governments are refusing to acknowledge the suffering caused by fracking and seem proud to claim that there have been no proven cases of groundwater contamination in Alberta. I don't think they should be proud. I think they should be deeply ashamed. It's pretty obvious that contamination has occurred in Alberta and elsewhere. I believe sufficient data and observational evidence was collected on my land and on my neighbours' properties to support the contention that the contamination of our water wells was most likely a result of local fracking, but I can't prove without a doubt that it was the case. Is absolute proof possible? And what would absolute proof look like? Is anyone out there in the regulatory world looking into actively pursuing how we could define such proof? Is there any motivation to do so? Let me state clearly that it has not been proven that coal bed methane was the cause of the water contamination at my property. Publicly available historical records show no evidence of gas in my water supply. When Jessica Ernst showed me documentation proving that Encana Corporation had actually perforated and fractured the aquifer that my water well draws from, I was outraged. It couldn't possibly be true, could it? I thought fracking only occurred thousands of metres underground, and that the drill casings were cement sheathed through the depth of the aquifer for protection. Isn't that what the government always says? But here it was in black and white right in front of me. Perforation depths as shallow as 121.5 metres, a depth that intersects with the draw point of my water well. Now, I didn't know anything about this in November 2005 when I called Alberta Environment to complain about the vast amounts of what I assumed to be methane in my water. I assumed it was methane because this is what came out of our garden hose. I was told by Alberta Environment that the problem gas was caused by bacteria, which was there as a result of negligent water well maintenance. The gentleman from Alberta Environment had not even looked at my water. This was an over-the-phone diagnosis. I wanted testing to be conducted to confirm this. He advised that I speak to Encana. Alberta Environment didn't see any need to be involved. I went to Encana and was given some plastic bottles. Encana told me to take samples from the tap and take them to the Calgary Public Health Authority. So I contacted Public Health, and no, they don't test for methane. So I got back on the phone to Alberta Environment and reminded them that groundwater protection is their legislative responsibility. But Alberta Environment told me that Encana would be hiring someone to conduct the testing and that they would providing me with a report. At my insistence, and considerable insistence it was, Alberta Environment came along and collected samples of their own for comparison. Results from the water samples collected on my farm show that the pH of my water dropped from a historical value of 8.7 to 6.8. For those not chemically inclined, that means that my water became acidified. The bacterial levels in my water plummeted. It had almost no living bacteria at the time of testing. And this is strange, because Alberta Environment was blaming the bacteria in my water well for creating all this gas. Imagine if I could create all that gas. Wouldn't that be something? Anyhow, all our energy security issues would be solved. You just don't clean your well and you're good to go. There was toluene in my water, so I asked what bacteria produced toluene. Toluene is a predominantly man-made organic solvent with many industrial applications. I used it daily when I worked as a lab technician for dissolving creams and waxes, and its reactivity means that it rarely occurs in nature. I'm not sure if you now know what I didn't know at the time, but in the drilling phase of CBM wells, companies are known to facilitate the fracking process using acidifiers, degreasers, and biocides to clean out the fractures before placing the proppants, which will keep these fractures open. It's not too big a leap to postulate that the most probable cause of the low pH, dead bacteria, toluene, and methane, all found in my water, got there as a result of industrial activity in the same zone as my water well draws from. I don't really see another more plausible explanation, and nor have I been given one to date. So far we are still at stage 1, denial. In Alberta today, ERCB regulations facilitate companies who choose to operate and produce methane in aquifers currently used for drinking water by the local population. Directive 27 requires that the resource well need only be 200 metres on the ground away from the closest water well, and Carlos showed you this slide last night too. So here it is. This is a diagram that applies up to 200 metres away. If the gas well is drilled 201 metres from the water well, the 50-metre vertical separation no longer applies, and drilling in the same zone as the water well is permitted. The vertical separation is only 25 metres. This is an old version, but it has been increased to 50 metres now, but the horizontal separation is still 200 metres away from the closest water well. Now, I'd like to give you another example of some of the world-class protections that we Albertans enjoy. This document was prepared by Alberta Environment in 2004, and it highlights the problems needed to be addressed for CBM development to proceed into the full production phase. Okay, what do we have here? Current regulation prohibiting the co-mingling of groundwater may conflict with CBM NGC objectives. NGC is natural gas from coal. It's the same thing as coal bed methane. Now, as far as I know, these regulations were in place to protect the integrity of the water. Water well drillers were not allowed to mix or commingle water from one aquifer to another, lest they spoil the water quality and cause cross-contamination between the aquifers. I wonder why now that someone can make some money from this, that water quality seems less important. Maybe they don't need that water, but I do. The need to protect current water users who obtain water from coal zones that may be targeted for CBM and NGC development. The need to protect current users. I offer the Rosebud water supply as an example of how low a priority this must truly be. Make no mistake, the aquifer was not accidentally fractured. It was a conscious decision to go ahead with planned development. The community was never informed. Most of them still don't believe it. They just can't believe it. They wouldn't do that. I've shown them the slide. They still can't believe it. The anticipated need, in some cases, for dewatering coal zones for CBM NGC development versus the protection or sustainability of the aquifers. I don't think we need to add anything to that. Now, bearing all this in mind, let's get back to my story. Are you ready for the big surprise? And Canada's report on my water well said that they found the methane in my well had no connection to their drilling activities. Well, who'd have thought it, eh? And Alberta Environment concurred. I joined Jessica Ernst, Debbie Signer, Dale and Brenda Zimmerman, Sean and Ronald Lee Campbell in press conferences at the legislature to try to raise public awareness about the contamination issues that we were trying to deal with as individual Albertans. Shortly thereafter, the Alberta Research Council was hired by Alberta Environment to conduct what was to be called an independent review of all data collected throughout the complaint process at each of our properties. The Alberta Research Council was primarily a government-owned research and development organisation, which also received funding from and contracts from industry to promote and develop, among other things, new technologies to facilitate unconventional oil and gas extraction techniques. Now, I would ask, is this organisation in a position to independently give a non-biased review of complaints against the very people who pay their wages? Well, what did the Alberta Research Council conclude? I'm just going to read this to you. The Alberta Research Council's overall conclusion of the evidence from the review of all Alberta Environment and Alberta Energy and Utilities Board files, along with a new review and evaluation of additional data and aspects, is that energy development projects in the area most likely have not adversely affected Ms. Lauridsen's water well. Most likely have not. Most likely have not sounds like an opinion. It's not a scientifically proven fact. Debbie Signer also has contaminated water. Her water was being investigated by Alberta Environment at the same time as mine. She showed me the list of organic compounds found in her water by the Alberta Research Council. Contaminants, including all of the BTEX group. The BTEX group are widely recognised as being red flag indicators of petroleum industry contamination. These are benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. In the Signer review, Alberta Research Council did not explain or speculate on the source of these chemicals. They simply mentioned them in passing, implying that their presence was irrelevant, and moving right along, they concluded her report the way they concluded mine. Apparently, we have naturally occurring man-made chemicals in our water. I never saw the Alberta Research Council's review of Jessica Ernst's contaminated water, since none of these individual reviews were ever made available online. I do know that Jessica, Debbie, and I all received similar letters informing us that our cases were now closed. You see, Alberta Environment hid behind the Alberta Research Council. The Alberta Research Council came up with the big news that the gas in our water most likely originates from the shallow coal seams where most Rosebud wells are drilled. The report concludes that coal bed methane and other energy development projects have not impacted your water well. Based on these findings, Alberta Environment is closing this investigation. Now note the escalation of language. Most likely not has now become a definitive have not. There remains no proof to support this statement. Alberta Research Council was unable to provide proof to justify the government's conclusions and action. Statistical probability was used to close out contamination cases. The point of the statistics was to show that the gas in our wells is typical of the gas found in other area wells and is therefore naturally occurring. Well, of course it's typical of the gas found in the area. Where did they think it came from? Tuck. Anyway, our question was, and still is, why were we suddenly inundated with massive quantities of this naturally occurring gas in our water? Instead of answering or attempting to answer that question, the Alberta Research Council deflected the issue by closing the reviews with a statement of statistical likelihood. Most likely not is a statement of statistical interpretation. The closing statement, most likely not, is comparable to saying an airplane will most likely not crash in your backyard. That's true. Thousands of flights safely arrive and depart daily, just as thousands of wells are safely drilled in Alberta every year. Does that mean that airplanes never crash? Has the airplane industry come to a complete halt because sometimes things go wrong despite the best efforts of everyone involved? No. This industry maintains public trust by being openly accountable for errors made and harm caused. They don't blame the passengers. The evidence provided in the Alberta Research Council's review of the contamination events around Rosebud showed that attempts were made to blame the landowners for the problem methane, and that no attempt to accurately trace the source of that methane was made. There was withheld data. There was ignored data. The review contained a questionable hypothesis full of mathematical wizardry about methane molecules being too big to rise above the pressure of so much water pouring down the water wells, pouring down the fractures. It was chock full of hydrogeological academic intimidation to make sure you understand the width and breadth and depth of your ignorance. But, in the end, the conclusion that they gave was founded on a database they refused to disclose. That's right. The statistical comparisons were made with hand-picked data from undisclosed wells, which gave them validation for the open to personal interpretation, most likely not statement. Most likely not is a statement of statistical interpretation. That's what's true about it. Now, my examples of this can get a little bit tedious. It's quite technical, so you can bear with me, or you can nod off for a bit if you're not a details person, and I'll wake you up with a big finish. I just want you to know that I do understand the facts. and I'm really hoping that you'll understand them too when I get it. Okay, I'm going to show you some things from the review. This page shows a sample of the gas wells that were selected for comparison to the abundant gas in our water well after the arrival of coal bed methane in the Rosebud area. I am now going to highlight the wells that are on my land. Isn't Diana a genius? She did all this. Look at the far right column for data quality. The only wells which do not have acceptable data quality are on my land. The table shows that there is no isotope data available for CPM wells in the vicinity. So what did Alberta Research Council do about this? Did they request samples from these actively producing wells to acquire the necessary data? No, they did not. They had another plan. data from CBM wells from Township 45, ranges 20 and 21, was used to compare the Lauridsen well isotopes to typical deeper CBM well carbon isotopes. Township 45 is 100 miles away from me. We have no idea which wells or how many of these wells were used to form the database the statistics were created from. All we know from the review is that the wells on my land were not used. Why would Alberta Research Council use unidentified wells from 100 miles away instead of pursuing the information from the gas wells surrounding my water well? Well, since I never got an answer to that question from anyone in government or at the Alberta Research Council, I'm left to speculate. Perhaps Alberta Research Council had a special picture they wanted to create for us all to enjoy. Pictures, as we know, are worth 1,000 words, especially if the words are hard to understand, as technical data tends to be for those not trained in the sciences. One of my husband's biggest beefs with the review was that it was so technical he found it almost impossible to read. It made him feel stupid. He was very intimidated by it, and he's not a stupid man. He is well read, and he has a BA. This report is not accessible to untrained people, and I think the Alberta Research Council is most likely aware of that. They also most likely know that most of us can look at a picture, or a histogram, even if you don't know what a histogram is. And Peter certainly had no idea what a histogram was, or how they were created. This is a histogram from the Alberta Research Council review. The histogram shows my well in green and CBM wells in red. GOWN stands for Government Observation Well Network. These results from the government-owned wells are displayed in ice blue. The D35 wells are in royal blue. The D35 group are results from water wells tested according to the parameters laid out by ERCB Directive 35. The deep conventional wells were assigned purple. Most people will read this as though it were a graph, because a great many people simply don't know how to read a histogram. As you can see, my green well appears to be to the left of the red CBM wells in this depiction. And if you read this like a graph, there is an apparent separation of values between CBM wells and my water well. What I want to demonstrate to you is an understanding of how a side-by-side histogram displays information and why that is significant to the presentation of the image. Histograms show groups of data. The height of the bars show the number of wells that fit into the group you select. In this case, the groupings are in 2-unit increments. For example, if you look at the grouping which has been labelled 64, it represents wells whose isotope values lie in the range of 64 plus or minus 1. When I show you my histogram, it's easier to see the boundaries of these groupings. And this is all thanks to Kai, who did this for me. On the top left of this page, I replicated the Alberta Research Council histogram. At least Kai did. The background squares define where one group begins and another group ends. The colours are different because my software program is a little older than the one that they used, but inputting the data into my computer gives me the ability to create the other 3 histograms. They are all displaying exactly the same data. I have created the corresponding stack chart histograms to the right of the side-by-side charts because it's simple to see in the stack charts that all I have done is change the colour assignment of the well types. The 2 charts look the same other than the colours. With the stack charts, we piled the same groups on top of one another so that you can clearly see that my water well is in the same group as some CBM wells, some D35 wells, and one of the county wells. If you look at the side-by-side histogram on the left, you can see how the computer always spits out the colours in the same order according to the key shown at the side of the charts. Blue, red, green, purple, turquoise, blue, red, green, purple, turquoise. In the bottom histogram, I asked the computer to display the Lauridsen value after the CBN value within this same group. I did this by making the Lauridsen well turquoise and the CBN wells red. Now you can see the overlap. The turquoise bar is in between the red bars. Alberta Research Council displays the Lauridsen value before the CBN values by making the Lauridsen well red and the CBN wells purple. The computer always displays the red bar to the left of the purple bar. And now you would only see the overlap in values if you understand how to read a histogram. The three histograms I created clearly show that there is overlap between the methane isotope values of CBN gas and the methane isotope values found in the gas in my water well. There is no confusion. The same cannot be said of the Alberta Research Council's image. Reading the Alberta Research Council histogram correctly is confusing. Believe me, they want you to be confused. I'm going to quote to you exactly from the review. From a visual observation of the plot, it is observed that the CBN wells have a less depleted, less negative methane isotope signature. Well, that's a big statement. Less depleted signature than what? Conventional wells? Most D35 wells? My well, if you read it as a graph? You're being instructed to visually observe an illustration that is potentially deceptive to the layperson. Now, let me show you what they did with the ethane. This is the ethane histogram from the review. The ethane illustration, for the ethane illustration, the Research Council chose a stack chart histogram, which I prefer because I think it gives a clearer picture of the groups. So you would think that I would be happy, but actually I'm not. If you notice, there is no Lauridsen value on this chart. There is also an incomplete display of the range in ethane values of CBN wells. The chart shows the range in values for CBN ethane as being -43 to -47, displayed in 2-unit increments. In this next slide that I've created, I have inserted the average or mean Lauridsen ethane value of 41.6, which I got from 7 separate analyses conducted by Dr. Rosebud. This value is displayed in light blue. When I insert the full range of ethane values given in the tables in the Alberta Research Council review, you can see the overlap with CBN isotope values and my water well isotope values again. The given values range from -40.5 to -45.7. You see, not only did the Alberta Research Council claim that they could not get meaningful ethane values from the gas in my water, they also forgot to put their own data into the stack chart. Now that's a whoopsie, isn't it? You see, I'm not making this up. Here's the tables from the review, and I've highlighted the missing ethane data. The Alberta Research Council could have used the histograms I created. I used the scant data I could glean from the tables and the histograms presented in the review. The histograms or depictions that I have presented give a different impression. They illustrate that there may be a possibility of CBN involvement in my water well. There may be a possibility that errors made by the Alberta Research Council could lead to contamination events going undetected and being improperly addressed by our regulators. Like I have said already, histograms are statistical representations of a database. The Alberta Research Council refused to release the complete data set. Why? This is the data set they use to close out contamination cases, and that makes it a public matter. The information must be made available for assessment of its relevance to the reported contamination events. Water is publicly owned. The information was collected at the public's expense. Why is the government allowing this information to be withheld? In a glib summary of CBN-related water well complaints, lumped all together for all of us who ventured up to the legislature, Dr. Blythe expressed concern that the complainants may not be able to accept proposed resolutions because of outstanding non-scientific issues, such as trust, or acceptance of scientific rationale, or lack of understanding. I'd like to clarify that no resolution was proposed to any of the complainants, and that my objection to the conclusions of the Alberta Research Council review is based entirely on science, because I have a pretty solid understanding of scientific rationale. Jessica Ernst has a master's degree in science. We have an educated population. I am certain that the Campbells have a very clear understanding of their situation. I find Dr. Blythe's remarks on this subject to be inappropriate, inaccurate, and disrespectful. The complainants respectfully submitted examples of scientific errors and omissions in the individual reviews prepared by Alexander Blythe to the government, and requested an evaluation of his work from an out-of-coffin scientist to be agreed upon by all parties. The government refused to have a peer review done on the Research Council's work. Instead of acknowledging and answering our critically important questions, we each received this letter expressing the confidence the government had in Dr. Blythe's findings. It states that if we are dissatisfied with the decision to close the investigation, that the Ombudsman may be contacted. All the Ombudsman can do is check that proper government procedure was followed. There would be no evaluation of the content of the investigation. In other words, Alberta Environment was done talking to us. We can stick our water complaints where the sun don't shine. The government record of no proven cases of water contamination linked to fracking in Alberta remains intact. This is how seriously the government and regulators take groundwater protection. They believe that companies can safely produce methane from a coal zone which acts as an aquifer that people rely on for daily living. They assume that if they are 201 meters away from a water well, that there will be no migration of methane to that well. This is what computer modelling tells them, and by God, they're sticking to it. They will not heed what people living on the land observe or what lab results indicate. They have a computer model we must all live by. Our regulators can't catch a company caught wet-handed. If they won't acknowledge contamination this blatant, what on earth is going to happen with shale gas? It happens thousands of meters down. Are they going to make a connection? They can't connect it when they're right near water. Do you think they're going to connect all the way down there? Do I have confidence? I'm sorry, I don't. My experience tells me that I would be a fool. My experience with the government process is not an isolated event. It's all too common. The list of disenfranchised landowners continues to grow as a regulatory system in place too often allows oil and gas companies to walk away with impunity from the families' lives who they devastate. There are contamination victims throughout this province who know all too well who our system protects. People who lose dearly don't forget how they were wronged. It may not seem like it at the time to industry, but it's a lose-lose situation. There is no secure future or responsible decision-making founded on avoidance of accountability. You are operating on land where we have made homes and worked hard to build dreams and raise families. I am always horrified and amazed by people who say to me, Fiona, you can't expect them to own up to what they've done. Then they'd have to take responsibility everywhere they've contaminated people's water, and they can't afford that. Dissent between landowners and industry is a joint responsibility. It is a consequence of the abuse of power and the shrugging of shoulders. Well, I'm done shrugging my shoulders. I expect industry to take responsibility when they cause contamination and to earn public trust by doing so. I expect the government of Alberta to treat its citizens with more respect than I received. I'd like to know what the government and industry representatives mean when they say the gas in my water is naturally occurring. Is it some kind of clever doublespeak? Of course the gas is naturally occurring, and Canada didn't make the gas by themselves. So yes, I agree, the gas is naturally occurring. Now, back to the original complaint I made, with the slightly modified question I now ask: how did so much naturally occurring gas suddenly get into my water supply? Well, we don't know for sure. We can have our suspicions. We can observe commonalities between cases. But the government is done talking with us, and industry has the go-ahead to frack. The regulatory path has been streamlined to allow even more fracking, more than any landowner can probably imagine, because we're all still clinging to the notion that intensely disruptive fracking will never happen here, not like it has in the States. After all, we have different geology. We still have the same technology. Methane gas clings to coal by electrostatic forces in Canada, just like it does in the States. Different geology, same problem. The most upsetting thing I discovered is that government and industry on both sides of the border are comfortable with leaving landowners to hold the bag while they snub observational evidence and capitalise on the vacuum of absolute proof. Different regulators, same problem. We need to decide as a society how we balance the cost versus the benefits. We cannot do that if the government withholds critical information. Industry can be excused for promoting its own interests. They are a business. The government is supposed to represent the interests of the public, which is more complex than doing simply what makes money. When my family was approached by a documentary team, we decided that we were going to put this story out in the public domain. We had no idea how the film would turn out. We never met the editors of the film or the people who put up the funding. We gave interviews to a crew who filmed us over a 2-year period doing just about everything. We never saw the film until its release. I truly had no idea what was coming next on the film. I had talked a lot, just like I've talked a lot today. And I'm grateful to everyone who participated in making the film and to all of you who have watched it. And I sincerely thank you for listening to me today.